Hello, everyone. This thing is on. Great. So I'd like to invite my panelists up. So first we have Benji from the Seattle Department of Transportation, Benjamin de la Pena. Thank you for joining us. Now we have Eran from Nexar and Jonathan from Swiftly. So just to kick things off, could we just start by getting some information about yourselves and the work that you do at the different companies and agencies that you work at?
So I'm Benji de la Pena. I'm the Chief of Strategy and Innovation at the Seattle Department of Transportation. My two lines of work there is innovation mostly through lean transformation, and then helping the city prepare for how to handle information and technology. Two big important pieces of work. We did the new mobility plan in 2017. I led that work along with Evan Corey from Nelson Nygaard. And then we have a draft transportation information infrastructure plan that I'd be happy to talk about later.
Great.
So, hi everyone. I'm Eran Shir, CEO of Nexar. At Nexar, what we do is we operate a nationwide network of vehicles powered by our smart cameras, AR-powered cameras. And what that allows us to do is to basically map and monitor about 1.5 million miles of paved road every day.
Great, thank you.
And hi everyone, my name is Jonny Simkin and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Swiftly. And we're a big data platform for public transportation. So we integrate with the static timetables and then watch gather vehicle movement information to track the movement of those vehicles every couple seconds. And then we build predictive models around this information. So one of the core things we do is generate the ETAs that when you're riding the bus and it says the next bus arrives in 5 minutes, within Google Maps, Transit, City Mapper, a lot of the leading apps, we send the data to those apps for riders to access. And then we have a whole suite of tools internally for transit agencies to better manage their networks in real time, as well as to analyze the data coming from those networks to improve planning and scheduling.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'll give a little bit of background on myself and why I'm really excited about this particular topic. As the director of the TransTech Lab, which is a public-private partnership between the MTA and the Partnership for New York City, we know that in order to solve the next generation of public transit issues, we need to work together with private sector leaders and technology companies in particular that have developed really interesting technology and data strategies to make really insightful, really to generate great insights on data that's really otherwise just kind of sitting there that we're not leveraging. And Benji, you've said before that urban transportation has been upended by information. What do you mean by this, and what do you think are some of the biggest kind of positive benefits that we've seen with properly leveraging data?
I don't think that's news to the Commotion Ride, right? At least for the last 5 years. All of the new technology, all of the new modes disrupted both the way we understand how the transportation works in a city and how commuters themselves, the traveling public, use the transportation system. What it's done is two things: generated a possible source of new data for governments to understand, and I can go into whether we're ready to understand that or not. That's a different thing. And another is a whole slew of new modes and ways to travel that kind of broke down categories. And cities have adapted, right, with dockless bike shares, scooters, rules around these things. So it's great from the user point of view in that there are more options and that that the whole system can be more responsive. It has also created new problems because user centricity has not been counterbalanced by larger community goals that are not yet in a digital form that can interact these things. So it's been good, but as in any kind of technological shift, there requires an institutional shift that then follows, and that's where the city managers of transportation are now grappling with.
And from Nexar and Swiftly's perspective, what are some of the ways that you've seen cities leverage, infrastructure and transportation data to improve public transit?
Yeah, so I can give one example from our work with organization like RTC in Nevada and the city of Las Vegas, where they leverage real-time data about construction, around traffic, in order to basically make decisions on an hour-by-hour basis, on a day-by-day basis, on how to manage the roads, how to plan better. It's at the end of the day, I think like any kind of process, the quality of the process depends on the information you bring to the table. So the more kind of real-time information, the more accurate it is, the more agile and adaptive the city can be. And I think these are properties that are required as the strain on the infrastructure gets higher and higher.
Do you have an example of, maybe like a situation or a case study where Nexar's, data or insights have directly affected, the way that a city is moving or the decisions that it's making?
Yeah, so that's the right example. When you are giving permits today, if you're like, let's say, New York City, and you're giving permits to improve a certain road, or actually the network of roads, you're doing it on a basically blind basis. You give a permit to 6 months, you don't know when that will happen, etc. So what happens is that, the rains end, okay, and then all of a sudden all the contractor comes in the same week, and all of a sudden you have these massive traffic jams that you get alerted about after they happen, right? So what we have done in Las Vegas is actually empower the city to do that ahead of the curve, and leverage this data at the end of the day, empowering, giving sort of like a superpower to the actual people that are doing the work, so that they don't have to schlep around all the time trying to kind of chase the tail, but rather can figure out in an optimal manner where they should put their effort and time. Great.
And Jonathan, what have you seen on this side?
Yeah, I'll talk about 2 examples of transit agencies using data in interesting ways. The first is with the real-time information that I was talking about earlier. When you open a mobile app and it tells you the next bus arrives in 5 minutes, if you get to the bus stop in 5 minutes and then you see that that bus just departed, it's a pretty poor passenger experience because you have to wait the maximum amount of time for the next vehicle. And so what we've done is just change the algorithms that generate those ETAs, send it to the exact same apps that riders already use. And in a lot of cities, we see a 20 to 30% decline in passenger calls and complaints just from changing the data that people experience without even changing the user interface of those apps. So that's one. I think when it comes to infrastructure, there are a lot of really unique examples, and Santa Clara VTA is the one that comes to mind. So they found that over the last 30 years, the vehicle speeds have declined just due to increased populations and more congestion. And it cost the transit agency $70 million more per year to operate the exact same quality of service as 30 years ago. They did not be able to cover more passenger miles. It's just costing them more because the speeds have declined, so they have to throw more vehicles to be able to deliver that service. And when they looked at how they would resolve that situation, traditional data analysis techniques were telling them to basically change infrastructure or add BRT to entire routes. And when we started to look at the data in a lot more granularity, we found that it turns out the slowdowns weren't happening across the entire route. It might just be a specific intersection or a segment of a corridor that contributes to a majority of the delay. And so through our tools, you can visualize this information in a couple seconds, see exactly where those delays are occurring, and then resolve them. So they found areas to save about $10 million per year at less than 10% of the cost that was originally budgeted.
Were those infrastructure investments like paint and bus priority lanes or whatever?
Yeah, so they were infrastructure investments. Some of them were moving stop locations, consolidating stops, or going from near side to far side, or bulb outs, and then bus-only lanes. And then the last, which is more passive, is transit signal priority for specific intersections that were causing delays.
If I may ask, because it's interesting, there's the whole promise of real time and actual response, right? You may have real-time data of where that pothole is or where the delays are, which is great to get that data, but the actual response time of planning and actually executing or even sending out a team to inspect, you'd be lucky to do it in 2 days. And it's not because of any constraint in government, it's just process, right? So for things like that, that's one of the issues I talk about, and our panel is about data is the answer, what's the question, right? Is there, what information do you need and how often do you need it, right? So real-time information is alluring that way, but maybe for most of the functions of the Department of Transportation, actually, you neither need or need to ingest that much real-time data. And as a government, part of what it needs to think about is how it handles information and be very circumspect about what is the information we need for what function. Real-time operations is great for traffic operations. Usually flow and volume data are very, very useful. Spotting errors is great, that if you could correct it with traffic light signaling. Infrastructure problems like potholes, you can get that data on a weekly, monthly, or so basis, depending on the response time.
So I'd love to riff on that a little bit because, when we think of, really cool tech solutions and getting access to more and better data, we can sometimes do that, but then, bringing it to the relevant Department of Transportation and having a process in place and a direction to move forward with that information is a completely different matter. So how have you approached that in Seattle?
Well, that's part of the thinking that went into the Transportation Information Infrastructure Plan, which will remain in draft, and then maybe it'll influence something. But let me back up into a more philosophical question, right? So LA likes to say code is the new concrete. We like to say information is the new infrastructure. But that begs the question, what are we building? Why are we building it? And who are we building it for? And I think until departments of transportation become very, very clear of both the vision and mission that's guiding the work around information, and the values and the goals it's getting for, then the allure of just having more information is very, very strong, right? And that, the experience of the last decade of having too much information in centers of power becomes an existential threat, right? So I remember, sorry, this is 40,000 foot, but a decade ago we used to say data is the new oil, and people still say data is the new oil. Or I remember Tim O'Reilly saying that what's important is the data exhaust. And it's interesting that those metaphors then relate to the kind of existential threat that fossil fuels has done to the planet, or what exhaust does to our cities. So I think we've come to a point where we need to be very, very circumspect about what information we get. Rachel Caldicott in .Everyone UK has a really good piece called Just Enough Internet, and where she calls, we have to be, as government, very, very models of restraint in gathering information. And we have to be very, very clear first of what we need the information and data for and what function. And once we're clear about that, then we're then very much more clear about what the data is that we need, because we're responding to a question we're trying to solve rather than just the availability of data.
Now, from a private sector perspective, what experiences have you had, or what are some, best practices that you've found in working with cities that are able to ingest your data and do something productive with it?
I think in general, cities don't have, most cities, I should say, don't have extra budget lying around just to throw on data for no reason, right? Most people are very judicial on how they spend their budget, and they're coming from the use case. They're not coming from, I want to hold some data, but rather, how will this impact a specific use case, and convince me that that will happen. And then after you do that, then you start looking, oh, so now I can also do A, B, and C, and it's sort of like a ladder, right? Like, I'll give you one example. When you move from surveying the roads once a year to surveying them once a week or once a day, okay, so you have the same survey. You can take it, you know, basically copy, and you just have it at a better freshness, so it's better, right? You catch things faster. But then all of a sudden, when you survey things on a weekly basis, you can start thinking about use cases that are just not relevant on a yearly basis, right? Like, for example, doing A/B testing on how you manage the curb, right? So now you can basically take a certain road, change the situation just for that road for a week or for a month, and do basically a natural experience, see the impact of it, and within a few weeks you have data, right? So all of a sudden, cities can become agile. And all you've done, you took the same data, only moved the time scale. So I think this is the process, the natural evolution process that we will see, where you start with very, very specific use cases that are super justifiable, that bring, you know, either save money or generate revenue for the city. But then as that kind of materializes, people naturally start thinking, okay, what else can I do with this newfound power that I have?
Right, that's great.
Yeah.
From a Swiftly perspective, what have you seen as best practices?
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point around anchoring with specific use cases or pain points or challenges. But I think taking a step back, data itself, in my opinion, is pretty useless, and information is very valuable. So I'll repeat that one more time because I think it's really important. Data is useless, information is very valuable. And what I see from a lot of cities is they are rich with data and very poor with information. And so oftentimes when I go in, I say, you know, how are you measuring this? And they're like, oh, we've got all the data to do that. How are you measuring this other pain point around maybe travel time efficiency or vehicle speeds? We've got all the data to measure that. Okay, let's go into a specific use case. This one route is getting a ton of passenger complaints, and you're seeing declining ridership. How do you know what's causing the problem? Oh, well, we've got all this data. So what do? We hire a consultant. We spend about 1 to 2 years analyzing the data. And by the time we've analyzed the data, it turns out the entire road network and all behaviors have changed. So therefore, we got nowhere, but we spent probably somewhere in the range of a couple $100,000. So what we try to do is focus on delivering information within minutes that drive that smarter decision while it's still relevant in the context of those streets. So that by the time the agency or the department is able to make a change, just like you said, you know, you can't change a process to fix a pothole. It might take a couple days. But if you're doing that a couple days after the pothole is discovered versus a year after the pothole is discovered, pretty big difference in terms of how city residents will react and respond to that. And so we focus on delivering valuable information as fast as possible to solve those underlying pain points or challenges.
Speaking of potholes, New York City last year spent $140 million just on settlements and lawsuits related to potholes. We got 61,000 potholes, and the main issue was that they typically became aware of a pothole because of the complaint, because of the lawsuit. So that delay in understanding what's going on with your infrastructure that you are liable to end up costing a lot of money. So that is just a small example of how like you said, insights and information can really drive action, can really, at the end of the day, save you money or generate money.
And to echo that, I mean, there's lots of use cases of these kinds of responses. At the root of it, though, is departments of transportation, which most of them grew up from Department of Public Works, or Department of Streets, which was street sweeping before we had cars, right, are good at building things and gathering information about building things. What they need to build, and this happens through all institutions, is the capacity to handle not data, but information, and decide based on that information, right? Their most capacity around data is gathering data to then model it and then do planning. Or real time in terms of seeing what's happening in the transportation, the traffic situation, that then you can manage it. But the ability to then say, here's intelligence coming from that information and respond quickly is a muscle we still need to build and develop, right? And that comes to the root of how do we manage information? We as government are used to collecting data, lots of data, right? And there's rules about that collection and how you hold it. We're not very good at both transmitting that data out so the rest of the ecosystem can act on it, nor are we actually very good at transmitting data within our silos, right? So there's a lot of waste in, here's data coming from this output, I translate it into an email, Word document, or an Excel file that then you go transmit it. So smoothing that out into API services would be one area of growth, but it's a response to information is great. We need to build a response muscle around that, built on the functions that we have to do as an agency.
So I mean, one of the things that we know about building kind of like the cities of the future is that we need to have more dynamic ways to kind of like pilot and test potential solutions, kind of like you said. But that also means that we basically need to work in different ways with public and private sector partners. So, just in your experience, and maybe starting with you, Benji, what are some cases where you've seen that, working with the private sector or working with technology has allowed, the Seattle DOT to address issues that it really wouldn't have been able to do maybe just on its own internally?
Well, on technology, right, we were the first to pioneer permitting dockless bike shares. And that went well for the city. It came from a failure of trying to roll out dock bike shares and a failure of the business model behind it. Dockless bike shares were showing up. We pivoted enough, or this was before me, so the agency pivoted and was able to permit, and it worked really well. Of course, this whole space is still very unstable, right? So of the 3 companies we started out as dockless bike share permittees, only 1 remains, and so there's always that public partnership with new technology that comes in, whether it's vehicular technology or a new service. Then there's data we get for them that helps us to plan for the new service, and all of the traditional data that we get from systems that already exist that, sadly enough, exactly as Jay was saying, we then turn to a consultant to interpret the data we already have. One of the things that we try to do is I hired a data library, and we have a data library because very often one segment of the agency would hire a consultant to find information that another segment actually already had, except that we had no way of knowing where that was. Sorry, that doesn't go into your question, but there's a lot, I think, of improvements that can happen from learning private sector and technology like, say, Nexar, that could help us, or Swiftly, that could help us understand the system.
And maybe from your perspective on the private sector side, what do you think cities should be doing better to work with, technology companies, private sector companies that have solutions that we may not be integrating?
You want to go first? Yeah, sure. I think, and by the way, I'll take a step back. I have nothing against consultants. I actually think they're exceptionally valuable. I would just rather see their time being focused on delivering their expertise rather than analyzing data for 6 months, because I think you can shave off that first 6 months down to about a week, and then focus on whatever that outcome should be. But as far as areas that cities can improve, I think one of the things I absolutely love working with cities is that, and folks at cities, is that they genuinely care about their communities, and I think that's probably also why a lot of us are here. So I think that will and that motivation is there. The challenge, in my opinion, often actually comes from the procurement process. So in the procurement process, there might be a 200-page RFP with somewhere between 5 to 25 pages of feature checklists because that's the way it always has been. And I don't think that features are useful. In fact, probably most of us, or more than half of us, have an Apple iPhone in our pocket. And if you look at them, they've actually focused a lot on minimalism and removing features just to help you do the things that you need to do most frequently, really quickly and easily. And so if we focus on solving pain points and challenges rather than building a million features, I think that's ultimately what's best for everyone. And so I would love to see RFPs shift away from feature sets to, I have this challenge or I have this pain point. I need to solve it as efficiently as possible. How can you, as an ecosystem of vendors, help me solve those problems? And I think if we do that, we can make RFPs a couple pages, and we can also tell vendors to prove their solution before spending millions of dollars and waiting 3 to 10 years to see if the solution actually worked.
So first of all, what he said, okay, but I would add to that I think the best thing that cities can do is actually invest time in understanding their strategy on the short term versus the long term when it comes to data and information and insights and intelligence, right? Because 10 years from now, I venture to guess that you will actually have digital twins of entire cities, okay? Which means that you will have a digital model of every street, every vehicle, maybe even every pedestrian, all mapped as a full dynamic simulated model. Okay, so that's going to take a while to get to, and you also need to think about how do you want to address such a capability. Do you like it? You don't like it? What do you want to get out of it? But at the same time, you need to be smart about what's happening right now. How do you leverage what's possible right now? And I think typically what happens is people are either addressing this as kids in candy stores, and you kind of, I want this and this and this and that, without full strategy behind it, or they're like, okay, this is, too scary or too new to me or stuff like that. So I think you need to, most private companies are actually, of this day and age, are actually interested in learning the problems of the city and trying to solve them in an earnest way. So I think that the best way to address this is to actually engage and to over-communicate the pains and problems. Rather than the solution and say, I want this feature and that feature and et cetera, say what are the key pain points from the ground, and engage with the private sector around, and with your citizens, I should add, around trying to find the optimal solution for everyone.
To add to that, right, it's interesting that City Mart, I'll make a plug for them, that was exactly what they were trying to change, the whole procurement process of coming with a question rather than a set of specs. I think government should also be better at, and they are, except they haven't thrown it at technology, talking about outcomes, right? So it's not what technology is available, but what outcome are we trying to get to? And so the question to whoever is offering up a service or so is, how does that benefit, how does that lead us closer to the outcome? What the technological regime has done, which is great, is it's user-centric, right? All of the new services are built on understanding the user, which we needed in transportation because, frankly, the taxi experience was horrible, so that's why the TNCs worked really, really well. What we need to do as servants of our community is to say, what are the big societal goals that we need to meet that are not going to be addressed by technology built on user-centric? And the city itself is a user in a sense. And say it should help us achieve that. That's what we did in the New Mobility Playbook, to say we don't know what new technology is coming. We do know what kind of city we want. And technology has to help achieve that, because the last time cities met up with new technology, transportation technology, we changed the way we plan cities and the way we built cities around that particular new piece of technology, which was the horseless carriage. which, by the way, is also very user-centric in its design because it allows you to go from your home to wherever you want to go with a parking space at either end. There are big moral imperatives, particularly where we are now, right? How does the information system and whatever technology help us address the climate crisis? How does it help us to advance equity? How does it help us to protect privacy, right? And how do we make sure the playing field is level, at least, if not tilted to where there's been a lot of injustice, because it can get very, very fragile if a particular technology dominates and then the company that owns it either creates a monopoly or then suddenly collapses. And that's happened in transportation before.
Right, and I think that's one of the big, that's one of the questions that we'll need to kind of sort out in creating this future platform where, we were talking about every street can have its own API. How do you see that happening in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see, citizens, companies, cities, both getting more data, but to your point, creating information and insight out of that data, and who owns that? Where will that live?
I think it becomes an ecosystem, right, of a free exchange of information that cities have information about the state of the transportation network, where the permits are, where there's going to be a closure, where the potholes are based on complaints or coming from the feed, right? And we need to feed that out so that the rest of the ecosystem knows it. Or we can incentivize particular behavior. So the whole situation with personal navigation apps routing you off the highway to the nearest residential road, which then puts the kids who play on that residential road in danger or clogs it up really quickly, could be solved if cities could then push out information that says, not that street, 5 streets down, we've given you a green wave, so it helps. Or, yes, you can take this street, but it's $5 right now. And 2 more cars, and now it's $10, so you have to build for it. So we need to build out the infrastructure that can do that, can both, there's a technological issue behind it too, because nearly all cities have built up their data on S3 ArcGIS, which is great. I have maybe in my agency 100 people who know how to use it, 50 expert people. The rest of the transportation tech doesn't run off Esri, right? It's on GeoJSON and Python and whatever else. And our ability to communicate information is a little hard. We're not good at APIs. We're testing out APIs. So if we have huge parking data, what happens is, and we have a lot, we take a data set of 3 billion lines, give it to the agency or the vendor. It takes them 6 months to process it so that then you will know where to pay at what rate. Which means we can't do the whole, let me change the parking rate right now today because our technology locks us into a particular format. So we need to go shift and talk the language the rest of the technology is using and then be able to communicate freely. No one needs to hold it. We just need to. It's the same way the internet was built, right? The centralized versions didn't work.
That's exactly a great point. The same way the internet was built. The internet is built on a set of open protocols. They're not owned by anyone. They are free for except H.264. They are free for you to use. But you go and you pay your ISP so-and-so dollars a month for him to implement those protocols for you, right? So you pay some service fee to get value that is on top of a public open infrastructure. And I think that's what cities should strive for too. We, for example, we're trying to do what we preach. So we're working with the IETF, which is the Internet Standard Body, to build this kind of real-time protocol, open protocol for geostate, right? Basically looking at this particular area of the road and saying, okay, what's happening now in real time in that area, giving it an IP address, and allowing everyone to both produce data if they pass there or consume it. Okay, so that kind of open. This is just one example. Other companies or other organizations are doing other innovations, but the point is that at the end of the day, whether this will sit in the cloud or in the 5G telco operation, metro base stations, or in some other kind of mechanism is less of an issue, because there's some bits going on and someone needs to pay the bills for that. But the real point is that you want to push for this to be open, for this to be a level playing field, for everyone to be able to play together. And the cities have the power, the cities and state, to set up the rules. Because at the end of the day, people will play in the game that regulation defines. So cities need to be smart about how they think about setting up the sandbox, rather than coming and saying who will play and what will be the score.
So I'll go back to something that you mentioned, Jonathan, about the procurement process and how cities are really engaging with kind of like innovative mobility leaders, and just actually plug that in New York, we'll be hosting a signaling conference. So, about a few months ago, New York City passed a $52.2 billion capital plan, $7 billion of which will be spent in re-signaling, the subway system. And what we know also is that there is a small community of vendors that, have been proven to work effectively with New York City. But there's also an opportunity in this re-signaling in New York to bring in new vendors who might have interesting capabilities that the city has not explored before. And so, again, we're asking this question with this opportunity to re-signal New York City. What can mobility innovators do to improve on the way that we've done things before? So, if you go to transitinnovation.org, you can sign up and pitch, any potential solution that you might have in that respect. And I think it's really, from New York's perspective, opening up this dialogue, not to go from the RFP kind of, we have a problem and we think we know what the solution is, but rather we have a set of challenges and we're not exactly sure what the solution is, so we can ask open and broad questions and attract a variety of solutions that we may not even be aware of. So my last question would be, for cities that are kind of like at the beginning of their smart city, kind of like renovation, or for companies that are coming into this sector and building technology that might be helpful for smart cities, what recommendations do you have either for pitfalls, not to, issues, that you might find at a transportation agency, or from the building of a technology company? What are some recommendations that you might have to, be a good partner to transportation agencies and to be an effective partner in improving public transit?
All right, I guess I'll start if you're both looking at me. So we already talked about outcome focused, so I don't think I need to talk about that more. But I would say interoperability and being future-proof would be principles. So I think it's important to start off with principles before you go into specifics. And when I think about those principles, I'll give you an example of why they're really important. For example, take your phone, right? Every year or 2 years or 3 years, you tend to update your phone. If you go to intersection and you look at the intersection control unit, or you look at the hardware on board a bus, it probably hasn't changed for 10 to 15 years. And so while the whole world has been evolving at this really rapid pace, a lot of the public sector is stuck on technology from 10 to 15 years ago, and there's two reasons why. One, a lot of the intellectual property and the ability to make computations is done on that device, which means it's a custom device that's very expensive and hard to replace. And then the second thing is that that device is generally a closed ecosystem. So the way that vendors generally sell to government is you put their device wherever it is, and the only way to talk to that device is through a proprietary interface. So even if the contractual side were very flexible, a city can't go in and spend $50 million replacing all of the traffic signal control systems because the only way, first of all, you don't have that budget, and then the only way to update those devices is through that same vendor. And we see this across all different verticals that touch public sector. And so when I talk about interoperability, I don't even think you need to go into data ownership. It's really around data access. If anyone uses Slack, Slack has all these integrations with other apps, or if you've used any Google property, you can sign in to other tools with your Gmail, and it will carry over your information to those other apps or tools. And so regardless of who owns the data, the ability to have multiple systems communicate with one another provides a ton of flexibility that can then future-proof a system so that if you don't like this hardware unit that you installed wherever you installed it, you can have a different way potentially to communicate with that hardware unit. So I think being interoperable and focusing on generalized solutions that take the intelligence out of that device and bring it to a cloud with a standard way of communicating to that device will have a huge impact on both the cost structure, but also the ability for government to innovate so they don't have to be stuck with technology from 10, 15 years ago.
I would say, maybe concretely, if I were a mayor, I would set up a rule that says no engagement will be approved if it will result in vendor lock-in, right? So just kill vendor lock-in. This is basically the private sector taking you for a ride. Stop it. Okay, no reason for it. And for companies that are trying to work with the public sector, I'd say, first of all, yes, you need patience, that's for sure. But the other thing you need, I think, is to really show the value that you're bringing in a very, very concrete manner. Ideally, even before you're making a deal. I think that's always true. We are all human, and we want to touch and feel and understand what it is that we're buying. But it's even more so in the public sector, because at the end of the day, someone needs to be your hero, your champion. You need to make someone a hero in order for you to be successful. And for that, you need to provide really concrete value that is tangible, that everyone understands.
Second, what they said, particularly about not vendor lock-in. A mentor used to tell me, don't fall in love with the solution, fall in love with the problem, right? So the city's job is to put that question forward and have kind of larger societal goals we need to achieve and evaluate technology as it comes, knowing that you want to keep that Overton window expanding and what's the next adjacency. The other is that cities need to think about information as an asset and need to manage it as an asset. And that's a key thing that I think not too many agencies, none that I know, really know yet what that means. Right?
Thank you, and I feel like this is a perfect dovetail to say that this is exactly what we're doing at the TransTech Lab and Transit Innovation. So we do have applications open for mobility innovators that want to work with New York City until November 30th. So if you go, again, to transitinnovation.org, we would love to work with you and learn about the work that you're doing. And thank you all so much for joining us today and for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.